Hi everyone. I wanted to talk to you briefly about chapter 15, but it's probably going to be a little long because this is a pretty long chapter compared to some of our other ones. In fact, I strongly suggest doing this chapter in sections because it's the senses, the special senses, and each sense can kind of be tackled by itself separately. So your chapter divides it up. First you start with olfaction. Olfaction and taste are very similar. They're both dealing with chemoreceptors. Of course, you have to be familiar with like the anatomy of the nose, and then the pathway of the olfactory nerve and the olfactory tract, where it goes and where it's perceived. But you should also understand how the chemoreceptors work in your nasal cavity. And that's there for you on page 502. Taste is the same idea. You have different types of papilla or taste buds on your tongue, understanding which is which and which they have different purposes. And then again, the kind of signal transduction and how that pathway works with the chemoreceptors is all there on page 506. And then the three major cranial nerves that intercept our sense of taste and their pathways and where they take that information is important as well. Then you get into vision, which is much more complex. Vision and hearing are the trickier ones out of the special senses. So with vision, you have your basic eye anatomy, which you'll cover in lab. It's pretty straightforward, nothing really tricky about the eye. The whole process of tear production is diagrammed out for you on page 509. That's important to understand. The extrinsic eye muscles is important. The reason vision gets a little tricky is because you have all of these different kind of mechanisms at stake here. So you have your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous systems working together to control your eye, to control your pupil, how much light is let in, etc., etc., and then the overall responses that go along with that and how that information is relayed. So it's a pretty complex sense. You see the general makeup of the lens and the cornea and the iris. That's there on page 513. That's actually a pretty good drawing there, how those little muscles hold the lens in place and how they bend the lens or restrict the lens to help direct that light back into the fovea centralis in the back of your retina. A little bit of information about the physics behind vision and the color spectrum. That's important to understand, as well as the idea of the light refraction, getting that light back and focused onto a certain point on the back of your retina is very important. Something that shocks most students and that is a common misconception is addressed on page 517, and that is the makeup of the back of the eye. Most students think that the light comes in and it goes to the back of the eye where it's received by the rods and cones. Most students already understand rods and cones, and then the rods and cones give that information to the optic nerve and it leaves the eye. Kind of, sort of. In fact, the back of the eye, where those rods and cones are, it's kind of like a backboard almost, like in basketball, how the basketball has to actually bounce off the backboard to go into the net most of the time. Well, that's kind of how the back of the eye works. That light comes in and kind of bounces off that backboard on the back of the eye, and then it goes through a series of different cells before it gets to the optic nerve, or those kind of ganglion cells that create the optic nerve. So that's an important pathway to understand, as well as the sequences that are drawn out for you on 518 and 519, the actual pathways for how vision is perceived, how color is perceived, as well as light-dark accommodation. When the lights go out, how it kind of takes your eyes a little bit of time to adjust. That's important to understand as well, and that's all on those couple of pages right there. Finally, moving on. Okay, getting into the actual visual pathways. Obviously, that's important to understand. That's bringing together, synthesizing what we did with the brain and the visual cortex, and now we're putting the actual optic nerve into that and where that goes. The optic chiasma crosses over and how it's going and branching to different parts of the brain. Very important to understand. Now we get to hearing and balance, which are always grouped together, although they're very different, even though they both take place in the inner ear. So understanding basic ear anatomy obviously is the first thing you need to do, and then understanding the organization of these membranes and bones that are inside of the ear. It's a pretty complex structure. On page 530, you'll see the differences between the vestibule and the cochlea and the semicircular canals, how they're all linked together on that inner ear structure, and you'll actually see how those stereocilia bend as the sound waves move by them. It's pretty cool how they are activated, and how they're activated in different ways depending on the pitch of the sound that comes in. And that's diagrammed for you on page 535, which you don't have to know the hertz values or anything like that on an actual cochlea, but it's an important concept to understand because that is all going to be received differently by the vestibular cochlear nerve, and that's obviously the nerve that's going to take this information to the brain. So depending on where on that cochlea is activated, that's going to help kind of decode the sound in the brain. Eventually you will get into balance, and that's all done through the semicircular canals. The sacula and the utricle are the major organs there at work, and they have these little cupula structures that kind of bend and flow, and then the otoliths, which are these little crystals that kind of tumble around inside the ear. And you'll see those on 538 and 539, basically telling you if you're moving or if you're still, right? Even if you're in the car and you close your eyes, you can still feel when the car stops. That's the whole idea behind those little structures. And then the last little section is always on aging and how everything basically slows down and stops working as we get older. So please let me know if you have any questions. Keep up the hard work. See you later.